Hello and welcome to another episode of Chats with Chip. I'm your host, Chip Griffin, the founder of SAGA, the Small Agency Growth Alliance. And I am delighted to have with me today a repeat guest, Nick Petroski of Promethean Research. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Thanks so much for having me again.
It is great to have you back, and particularly because we're going to talk today about agency salaries, something that I know I get asked about all the time. What's the right amount to pay my account manager or my project director or whatever the role is? And you've led some great research on this just recently, and we're going to talk about some of your findings and let people know what they would get if they actually were able to download the entire report. So before we do that, though, why don't you tell me a little bit about or tell listeners rather? I know lots about you, but tell listeners a bit about yourself and Promethean. Set the table.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Nick. I run Promethean. We do. I try to do the best research in the world on this stuff. I don't know if I do, but I like to think that I do. The digital agency industry as a whole is really interesting to me, and so I've just been asking questions since 2015, and apparently that's led to a bunch of people looking to me for answers. So it's worked really well. I do consulting work for digital agencies, so I help with strategy and kind of guiding how you should position yourself, how you can build repeatable rev gens is like the big one that I've been doing recently. Um, Kind of anything on the strategy side though, and it's been very interesting, and I love digging into different shops and seeing what they're doing, and because weirdly when I walked into this, everything I thought, oh, they're a digital agency is a digital agency, they're all the same. Yeah, this can't be too hard, and they're not. It is the exact opposite of that. So each one is really different.
They're all very different, and I would argue that they ought to be because they're all reflections of their owners and ought to be
Yep.
because as I always tell people, there's no reason to be running your own agency if you're not getting what you want from it. And that means that you have to structure it differently than you or I might because we're looking for different things.
That's perfect advice. I love it.
So you've done this research on salaries. Tell me a little bit about what the research entailed, and then we'll start talking about some of the findings.
Yeah, so we get this. This is the third time running this. And before I start, I want to say thank you for participating in this one. Your community was awesome. Getting more people involved in this and it only increases that salary transparency. So wanted to say thank you to you and your community first.
Well,
Um,
thank you. They are a great community and always
it's
willing to
fantastic.
step up, and they're hungry for information. So if it means they have to give some to get some, they're open to doing that.
That's how it works. We're all sharing here, right?
Absolutely.
So the research, it's the third time we're doing it. And it really came out of just wanting more transparency around this. You have different instances of large recruiting firms and large salary shops, uh, or large shops that will provide some salary data, but it was always kind of hard to tell. Like when you're looking at the salary ranges displayed, is that what agencies are really paying? Like, what are their costs associated with this? What are they really paying that developer? And so that's really what this was born out of back in 2018, I believe. Um, and so this was our third episode of it, and it's just increasing transparency. So we go out and we survey a bunch of different firms, and we ask them to just send over their salary data and their benefit data, and then we crunch all the numbers, and it results in what I think is a really transparent guide on not just what to pay different roles, but also kind of the overarching trends of what's happening in how you compensate your team, which is arguably more important.
Yeah, and you do take a look at all of the levers of compensation, whether that's salary, whether that's bonuses, benefits, time
Mm.
off, all of those kinds of things. And I think it is important to take a look at the whole picture because particularly today, employees I think are coming in and expecting not just the salary to be good, but also to have some of these other benefits. I mean, you even look at things like the difference between hybrid and in-person agencies and remote and all these different things. You look at the number of hours billable versus non-billable. There's just a wealth of data in there to go along with the expected thing you would see in a salary survey, which is a
Right.
long list of titles and what the ranges are for those roles.
Yeah, absolutely. It was super important to take that into consideration because when we did the first one, we did, but I got a lot of questions that were very detailed that I couldn't answer. So I'm glad we're on iteration number three now to be able to answer those a little more completely.
Yeah, and like anything, you learn as you go, right? So,
Exactly. It gets better, hopefully, right?
so what were some of the big takeaways that you had from
Mm.
this edition of the survey?
Yeah. So the biggest one is that the massive salary growth that we saw in the last survey has cooled. So last time we did it was in 2022, and we looked at changes from 2019 to 2022. And obviously, something big happened in that time period. And so part of that was a massive pull forward in digital transformation spending and digital marketing spend. What that resulted in was a huge fight for talent. And that was kicking salaries up. I believe the average was 25% salary increase from 2019 to 2022, which is just insane. It's very difficult for a digital agency owner to eat that kind of salary increase. And so what we saw in this one, we specifically checked for this again, was that the average growth rate of salaries between 2022 and 2024 was only 7%.
Mhm.
So that's kind of like more in line with typical raises and inflation and, cost of living upgrades, that kind of stuff. So it's much more manageable, especially when you factor in, some of the other work we do is around pricing and price increases. And so when you factor in the price increases that agencies were able to get in that time period, it kind of offsets or more than offsets this increase in salary.
Well, and I think that it's important to be thinking of pricing and salaries together, because part of
Mhm,
the reason why agencies feel so stressed when salaries go up is in part because many agencies, not all certainly, but many have traditionally underpaid their employees
mhm.
versus what they might be able to earn somewhere else, in part because they are not pricing high enough in order to generate a profit if they were to pay what are truly fair market salaries for the talent that they're getting. And then now you've got a situation where you had large salary growth. Now you still got pretty strong. I mean, 7% is still pretty strong, in a
Yeah,
2-year window. It's not nothing. Yet the prices the agencies are charging are not going up at anywhere near that kind of rate. And so, you do need to be thinking about the two hand in hand if you're going to be running a healthy agency.
absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that we were telling people, I'm sure you were telling them too, 2 years ago was don't compete on salary. You're not going to compete with the large tech companies on what to pay a developer. You just
Yep.
can't. So you have to build, and this goes into like the benefits and the stuff you brought up earlier, PTO, number of hours you're expected to bill, all that kind of stuff. That lifestyle that you offer for your employees and for your team, that's what you're competing.
Right.
It's not the salary. You can't. Impossible.
Right. Well, I think it's particularly acute for digital agencies when you're talking about, development talent, right? Because that's just there is a lot more of the frothy tech sector
Mhm.
spending that has been going on. It's certainly been cooling, and we've seen layoffs from some of the major players, but it's still they're always going to be able to offer more just because of the nature of what they do. But I would say that it's true across the agency community and not just in digital spaces that salary is only one piece of the puzzle. And if you're a small agency and you're competing against on the PR side, say an Edelman, right, they are likely going to be offering higher salaries.
Mhm.
But you, as a smaller agency, have other things that you have to offer or should be able to offer. And so, thinking about the entire package that you're offering your potential employee or to retain your existing talent is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I want to talk about this since we started wading into pricing and all that kind of stuff. Let's
Sorry
talk.
we
And you,
jumped
and you
into it
mentioned
into the deep end.
billable hours, and I found the slide in the report on billable hours to be really interesting, because if you listen to a lot of our fellow agency advisors out there, they will spew things like, you've got to try to get to 85% billable or 90% billable for some of your junior employees. And I always tell them that that's just rubbish, that you're first of all, I you shouldn't be managing toward utilization rates. If that's how you're managing your team, you completely lost the plot. And so, I can show you plenty of agencies that have really high utilization rates, are not profitable, don't have happy customers, don't have happy employees. So you need to look at the bigger picture. But I was really fascinated because across the board in digital agencies, they're only what, about 3/4 billable, something like that on average. I think it
Yeah.
was about 30
2
hours a
thirds.
week.
Yeah.
And different roles were even less than that, but that's the average across the board, counting everybody. So, you need to really be mindful of that when you're thinking about utilization rates and not go overboard.
Absolutely. Right? I think you captured it really well. It's gotta be a balance because if you're pushing them into that 80, 90%, utilized. Um, there's just not enough time for any kind of real thought work. Like I heard it put well when AI kind of hit the scene last year. Like, if you do push your kind of menial tasks off onto AI, and you can kind of push those menial tasks off onto even more entry level employees, um, the challenges that you're working with, that you're thinking about every day and constantly throughout the day, are more difficult. And if you try to just think about hard things for 8 hours a day, you're going to burn out. So if you're pushing that utilization rate to, crazy high numbers, you're either A, they're lying to you, like those aren't real utilization rates, or B, you're working them so hard that they're not going to be doing quality work anymore. They're not going to be happy doing it, and clients aren't going to be happy getting it.
Right, and I think more often it does come down to your employees will just lie to get you the number that you want to see because, I mean, I was a junior account executive many, many moons ago, and I know that I had certain expectations from the owner of the agency that I worked for, and she laid out, how much time we should be spending on certain clients and certain activities. And so myself, along with all the other employees, I can guarantee you our timesheets always fell within those ranges. I
Absolutely.
can also guarantee you that in no way reflected what the actual reality was. Because if we didn't put more time on certain clients, they would yell at us for not getting the job done. They would complain to our bosses, who would then tell us we needed to get the job done, but we also couldn't spend more time on it. So we just told everybody what they wanted to hear and tried to get through each day as
Yeah,
we could. And that is how employees function. It's not because they're evil, it's because
no,
they're human.
exactly. The incentives don't line up for them. They don't own a piece of the company. And even if they do, they don't own a big enough piece for it to make a, difference in their life.
Right. And so I was encouraged by this part of the survey because it suggests that the people who were submitting the data to you were being completely honest,
I
at
think
least as
so.
best they could understand, because otherwise they would be, reporting all sorts of inflated numbers to you to feel good about themselves, right?
Right.
So I mean
Exactly.
that is encouraging that they seem to be going down that path.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. Looking at like some of the individual ones, like I think the highest one, where is it? The highest one was a designer that, on average, the designers were expected to bill 31 hours a week. Um, and then your lowest one was in biz dev and sales, which was only expected to bill 7.8 hours per week. So you
Right.
have this kind of really, like you said it earlier, you have this really wide swath between, what type of role they're in and what type of billable they're expected to do. But nobody, even the designer at 31 hours a week, that's not insane. Like, that's not
No.
breaking anybody.
No, no, that's not grinding them down, and
Mhm.
it seems to suggest that it accurately reflects that they do spend time in staff meetings and,
Yep.
doing other things, and contrary to popular belief, all meetings are not bad. And so, when I talk to an agency owner and they say, "We have too many meetings. I need to cut back on the meetings." No, you need to have better quality meetings. You don't necessarily, it might be less, but it's the quality of meetings that sucks, not that the meetings themselves are occurring.
There you go.
So, obviously owners care about how much they make. So, there's a good section in the report where you address what the owners themselves are taking home. And I was incredibly encouraged by it because, I mean, A, it backed up what I generally tell people, which is always good,
Isn't that nice?
when my gut and experience and all that kind of match up with the reality of the data that you're producing. But it showed that the owners of small and medium-sized agencies made more than owners of large agencies.
Yep.
And it isn't the important thing to take away from that in my mind is it's not all about grabbing as much revenue as you can, because the
Mhm.
more revenue does not necessarily mean the more money in your pocket.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. It's all about what you said it right at the beginning. It's like, what do you want to design your agency to do? Where does this vehicle need to take you? And then what should that look like to take you there? Um, and if it's, a really nice comp package, maybe stay in that medium or small agency size. Like the challenges you're going to deal with are, they only get bigger. Like they only have larger numbers tied to them. So you might as well deal with less risk and enjoy it.
Right. Well, I mean, and the thing is too, I mean, small owners do still outpace, super solos or
Well,
studios or whatever you want to
mhm.
call the just a couple of employee agencies. So, there
Right.
is an advantage to getting at least a little bit bigger from that size, but you do hit a point of diminishing returns where you do just have larger scale problems to deal with.
Right.
And I think it's important not to be afraid of some growth, but it shouldn't be only growth that you're focused on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we think about the actual salaries and the
Mm.
data that those the tables in there,
Right.
some roles there was a really wide spread between high and low. I mean, dramatically. Sometimes it was a 2x difference between lowest paid and highest paid in it, and some they're a little bit tighter. Do you have any observations about those, or things that you take away from it?
One thing that really stuck out was how creative agencies are with job title.
There were certainly a lot of them in it.
Were there were so many, and so many of them were different variations of guaranteed the same job description.
Absolutely.
So in looking through it, that was my big takeaway was, maybe some standardization here could be helpful. Um, I see this a lot when you go out to hire, when agencies go out to hire, and they say, "We're looking for a business developer, someone in business development." And to the outside world in other industries, that is communicated as someone who's gonna deal with primarily partnerships. In the agency world, they mean that they want a salesperson.
Right.
And so you have this that's a the most common example, but you have this kind of thing where they're asking for certain job titles, and what they mean is different than what's being communicated out there into the larger world. And then they say, "Well, I'm having a little trouble hiring. I'm having trouble filling these roles." Um, and if there's some standardization there with the broader industries or other industries, I think it could help out pretty significant.
Yeah, and I mean, you've got to start with standardizing within your agency. I mean, one of the things that I
Hmm.
observe a lot of times is that even within an agency, they don't have good standardization. They don't have, you know, consistent salary bands based on title. And you just, it's natural. You start small and you just kind of start throwing around titles. And you're like, oh, this sounds good. That sounds good. This is what I need to bring in this person. And so all of a sudden you look at an org chart and you're like, this just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
And so I always encourage owners to think as early as possible in their evolution, even when they're just hiring one or two employees, to start thinking about the
Mhm.
hierarchy of titles and how you're going to compensate them so you don't create a problem down the road. Because I've seen too many mid-sized agencies really struggling to try to correct this
Yeah.
many years down the road, and it's really hard when you've got a lot of existing people because nobody wants to take a salary cut, nobody wants to have their title diminished. But if you don't do some of those things, then you're going to be in a position where you have great distortion within your ranks.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I think it's pretty synonymous with tech debt. So if you have, it's
HR
set
debt.
HR debt is essentially what it is. And I don't know if there's any firms out there fixing this. If there are, please shoot me an email because I have a lot of challenges, a lot of clients with challenges in this area.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, what you have to do is you just set it right going forward, and then hopefully through attrition, you can get to a rational place.
Yeah.
I mean, that's usually the safest way of dealing with it. There isn't some great magic wand that you can use. But I think that the other thing that that tells you, because you have that kind of lack of standardization across the agency industry, is you need to be a little bit careful even when you're consuming this data. There's a lot of good data in here, but you also need to think about it in context and understand that your junior designer may not be the same as someone else's junior designer. For titles like account manager, I mean, that's all over the map, right?
Yes.
An account manager in one place is like junior on the totem pole, but I've seen agencies where the
Mhm.
account manager is like the boss of things. You just don't know, and a lot of it comes from what the owner's background was,
Mhm.
how they had hierarchy of titles in some other agency, and so that's what they inherit. There's so many things that go into it, so be careful about saying, "Well, this data says specifically that,
Yeah.
my senior designer should be between X and Y,
Mhm.
and mine isn't." It may
Yeah,
still
and
be okay.
absolutely. And you have individual aspects of that too. Like it's not just the company, it's the how many years of experience do they have? Are they designing in the right world that you're in? Like, do they have experience doing stuff for product design if you do product design? Yeah,
Right.
it's very individualized, which just further complicates it. I guess the big takeaway is there's no easy way to just go about solving the salary challenge.
No, but I mean, it does. I think it is helpful when you sit down and you look at it and you say, okay, well, are my folks at least in the ballpark here?
Hmm.
And if they're not in the ballpark, then you start asking, well, why are they not? Are my employees markedly higher or markedly lower than the data that you're sharing? And if you can explain it, then that's fine. If you can't, then that's where you need to keep digging
Yeah,
until you can find the explanation for why you have deviated so much from the norm.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And then ultimately, you need to take your own data and figure out, are you actually profitable? Right? You know,
Yeah.
if you're paying your designer $90,000 a year, and so that comes out to whatever it is from an hourly cost basis for you, are you pricing their work high enough that you're still turning a profit on it? And if so, it kind of doesn't matter whether they're within the market guidelines or not, because you're making money.
Yeah. You said it right at the beginning. You cannot, distance this from the pricing conversation.
Right.
If you're up at the higher end on all of your salaries, well, that's fine if you're pricing appropriately for that higher like theoretically higher quality work. You should make your margin there. If your if your pricing's horrible though, and you're 10% higher and your standard, cost of goods sold is 55%, well, all of a sudden you're losing 5% on your bottom line.
Right.
And
Right.
that's a hit. That's a third of your average margins.
Right. And geography isn't as important as it used to be, but it used to be. I mean, if you had an employee at a New York
Yeah.
agency, they were naturally going to be paid higher than someone here in New
Mhm.
Hampshire. I mean, it just the cost of living is so much higher. You're just not even a junior employee. You're not going to get to be able to work for you in Manhattan for the same that you could get them to work for in New Hampshire. Now, obviously, with a lot of folks working remotely and all of that, it's a little bit less of a factor, but it still matters.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think back in, 2019, when we first did this, I think those differences were pretty stark. Um, we didn't get enough data from people in like the direct high cost of living cities to really do like a blanket kind of, do this in the report for every instance. But what I did find was that if you do live in a high cost of living area, or if you're hiring from a high cost of living area, add 10 to 20% to whatever the base, like the average salary line is.
Mhm.
And that'll convert or roughly convert this.
Before we're completely out of time here, I do want to touch base on, one of the other sections of this report, and that's the benefits. We've alluded to it a little bit before, but in the benefits section, were there things that jumped out to you, any key observations that you'd like to share with listeners about the benefits section of the data?
Yeah, overall, the benefits, like, so this was very much a US based report. Um, so we can talk about things like healthcare and things along those lines, stuff they don't have to worry about in other areas. Benefits, eh, they remained largely stable. There weren't any kind of major deviations from prior years. So it makes me, it's encouraging to see that, uh, even though 2023 was maybe a very rough year for a lot of agencies, um, they maintained providing, a good kind of well-rounded compensation package for their team. They didn't deviate largely from the norm. So it's nice to see that. It's very easy to start saying, okay, well, we're going to cut a bunch of benefits or stipends or whatever. Um, and if you do that, you're setting yourself up for longer term challenges.
But
But they
I
didn't
think
do that.
that's another area of the report that's very beneficial is it talks about, what some typical stipends are
Oh
for
yeah, yeah, yeah.
folks,
Hmm.
right? Which is not, a lot of agencies are like, well, should I give some kind of a conference
Yeah.
stipend or a home office stipend or these kinds of things? And you walk through in the report what some typical numbers are for agencies. So at least you have a starting point to think
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
on those things.
Well, you want to be competitive, right?
Mhm.
You ultimately you're providing a certain lifestyle and a certain amount of compensation. And part of that is those, do they get to go to various conferences? That can be a sizable perk for certain people.
Right.
And
And
it's
generally
good.
not a huge hit to the agency's budget. Right, so
Right.
I like agencies offering them because it's not a huge amount of money, and if you do it with very few strings attached, you can't just give it, willy-nilly, but at the same time, you should really empower the employee to make their own decisions about how that gets spent.
Yeah. Like, if I look at the different stipends available, education stipend on average is right around $900. You can go and get some decent training for that. Like, you're not gonna get all your certifications paid for, obviously, but
Right.
that's a good start. Same thing with the conference stuff. Conferences did take a little bit of a hit since last time, but it's still a few $100s. That's enough to usually go to a conference a year. And it obviously varies by role. So
Right. Right.
dig into the data, but
Right. And even if you don't look at the numbers, at least it gives you some ideas of the kinds of things that you might be thinking about
yes.
as an agency, particularly if you don't offer any kind of stipends to your team members
Right.
now. It helps you think about, oh, is that something that I should offer? And,
Mhm.
it's not even the dollar amount. It's should you have it? How would you use
Sure.
it? How would your team respond to it? And so it hopefully will open your mind as you read through this report for some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So if someone is interested in getting a copy of the full report, where should they go?
Yeah, it's I think there's gonna be a link in the show notes, but check
Absolutely.
out prometheanresearch.com. All of our research is pretty prominently displayed on our homepage and under our insights tab. Um, you can get obviously this full report there, and then there's a bunch of others that we've published over the years as well.
And as you say, there will be a link in the show notes along with a discount code. So I would encourage all of you to check that out and pick up a copy for yourself and supplement all of the spouting that I do on my various shows and in my articles with some actual hard data from Nick and his team. So again, my guest today has been Nick Petroski from Promethean Research. I appreciate your time. I appreciate the research that you've done here, and I look forward to having you back again to talk about some more data in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.